January 17, 1940. Kiel, northern Germany. A wind comes off the Baltic like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. It slides between tenements and along tram lines, pressing cold into stone and bone. In a kitchen lit by a single yellow bulb, a woman stands over a pot that barely steams. The smell is thin-boiled vegetables, a trace of coal smoke, and the sour edge of rationed fat. On the table, bread is dark, dense, measured. Outside, the street carries the cadence of a nation training itself to obey. Boots, whistles, distant engines, and the radio voice that always seems to know what the future demands. She has been told what women are for. She has been told what freedom costs. She has been told what America is: loud, loose, decadent, weak, a place where women talk too much, where families break, where order dissolves into indulgence. A place that cannot endure hardship, cannot sacrifice, cannot win. And in January 1940, that story still holds. The Reich is still expanding. The banners still rise. The propaganda still sounds like inevitability. But history does not respect inevitability. Years later, after the long, grinding collapse, after cities become rubble and trains carry strangers toward uncertain fates, German women who served the war machine in its last desperate phase will be captured and processed through Allied systems. Some will be held in American custody in Europe. Some will be funneled through the vast American prisoner apparatus that, in different forms, held hundreds of thousands of German POWs. And for a number of those women, the shock will not come first from interrogators or documents or classrooms. It will come from the sight of American women, from how they stand, from how they speak, from how they move through authority without looking like they are borrowing it, and from a single recurring object so ordinary in America that it is almost invisible, yet so extraordinary to those raised inside a culture of scarcity and control that it becomes a kind of symbol. A quiet argument against everything they were taught. American white bread, soft, bright, plentiful, served not as a ceremony, but as routine, again and again in mess lines and camp kitchens and occupation-era distributions. That bread will return as a sensory proof that an idea called democracy is not only an abstraction, it is a system that produces. It is a system that distributes. It is a system that can afford astonishingly to feed even those it has defeated. This is the story of an encounter that did not end the war but helped end a spell. Because ideologies can survive artillery, but they struggle to survive contradiction. The war that carried that contradiction across the Atlantic was not only a war of tanks and fleets. It was a war of logistics, paperwork, and the hidden arithmetic of calories. It was a war of institutional stamina, of whether a society could mobilize without devouring itself. Nazi Germany tried to answer that question with coercion. America answered it with production. By the time German prisoners began arriving in large numbers on American shores, the United States had built an immense, standardized system for captivity. A commonly cited figure places 425,000 German prisoners held in 700 camps across the country during World War II. Barbed wire, watchtowers, barracks wires, but also mess halls, libraries, sports fields, classes, and a bureaucratic insistence, at least on paper, on compliance with the Geneva Convention's requirement that prisoners receive quarters and rations comparable to those of the captor's own troops. That standardization mattered more than it seems. Totalitarian systems thrive on arbitrariness, the uncertainty that makes a person bend before authority. Predictability is a subtle kind of mercy. When a system is predictable, the captive mind begins to breathe again. And when the mind breathes, it begins to compare. It begins to measure. It begins to doubt. Those doubts were not merely political, they were physical. On ships returning from war zones, German prisoners encountered meals that undermined the Reich's narrative before a single American lecture was delivered. The world they were entering did not look like a starving, decadent society on the verge of collapse. It looked like a society that had enough fuel, enough food, enough organization to run a war and still eat well. The effect of that first impression is described repeatedly in general accounts of German POW life. The country's undamaged prosperity, the sheer scale of it, and the prisoners' astonishment at a logistical machine that seemed to function without visible desperation. For German women captured later, often in the final months when Europe was unraveling into hunger, flight, and panic, the encounter with American provision could feel even more surreal. They did not arrive from the relative order of a 1943 battlefield. Many arrived from chaos columns of refugees, smashed rail lines, half-starved garrisons, hospitals overwhelmed, cities burning. Their bodies carried the war's endgame: exhaustion, malnutrition, fear. And fear, especially for women, had been cultivated deliberately. Nazi propaganda did not only demonize the enemy, it weaponized the female imagination. It painted captivity as humiliation. It warned of barbarity. It suggested that surrender, especially for women in uniformed service, would be a kind of social death. So what did they expect when American guards appeared? They expected men who would take revenge. They expected contempt. They expected the cold, punishing logic of victors. They expected to be treated as spoils. Instead, in many documented accounts of U.S. custody, what confronted German prisoners first was not tenderness, but rules. Rules about processing. Rules about processing. Rules about meals. Rules about medical checks. Rules about work, pay, and camp order. Even in specialized intelligence facilities like Fort Hunt, known as PO, Box 1142, where high-value prisoners were interrogated. Official accounts emphasize that interrogations relied on psychology and deception more than physical violence, describing it as a battle of the wits. Fort Hunt processed thousands of captives in a tightly controlled environment, with elaborate surveillance and careful procedure. WWII. Fort Hunt was not the typical POW camp, and it was overwhelmingly male prisoners, yet the larger point stands. The American system wanted information, labor, order, and it tried to achieve those ends through administration rather than ritual cruelty. That difference alone could be destabilizing to people raised in a political culture where power proved itself through fear. But for German women captives, the destabilization had an additional, intensely personal dimension. They saw American women not as rare figures, not as symbolic mascots, but as participants in the war machine, training, working, administering, enforcing procedures, moving inside military life with a kind of professional ease. At Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, for example, the site functioned during World War II as the 3rd Women's Army Corps Training Center, through which roughly 50,000 American women passed from January 1943 to July 1945. The very skeletons of thousands signals that this was not a novelty. It was mobilization for women raised under the Reich's gender ideology, where even when women worked, the state tried to frame it as sacrifice rather than agency. The sight of American women in uniform represented a different social contract. It was not simply that American women worked. It was how they carried themselves while doing it. In Germany, womanhood had been organized around prescribed roles, even when war forced those roles to stretch. The state claimed ownership over the female body as a national reason, for production, for reproduction, for morale, for discipline. The ideal woman was praised for endurance, for obedience, for sacrifice, for silence when silence was required. American women were not free of expectations or constraints, far from it. But German captives often encountered a distinct outward posture. Women who spoke in public without apology, who interacted with male authority without shrinking, who appeared to possess not only duties but personal autonomy. And this posture, the posture of a citizen rather than a subject, was what shook them. It is difficult to overstate how much authoritarianism relies on posture. Not posture as vanity, posture as worldview. A dictatorship trains the body to reflect hierarchy: eyes down, shoulders in, voice lowered, permission requested. Even the confident learn to perform deference because the cost of misreading power is high. So when German women captives encountered American women whose bodies did not perform deference, women who stood as if the world did not own them, it created a kind of cognitive dissonance. The propaganda image of America had promised chaos, vulgarity, moral weakness. But the women they saw did not look chaotic. They looked composed. They looked secure. They looked unafraid of being noticed. And then always the bread. In the American POW system, the Geneva Convention requirement that prisoners receive rations comparable to American troops meant that prisoners frequently ate what American soldiers ate. That is documented repeatedly in broad accounts of German POW life. All prisoners ate the same rations as American soldiers. The significance is not only ethical, it is psychological. Food becomes ideology when it is scarce. And in Germany by late war, food was ideology. Rations were not simply nutrition. They were a daily reminder that sacrifice was demanded, that hardship was patriotic, that scarcity was virtue. Hunger became a kind of moral currency. Then captivity inverted the logic. German prisoners found themselves in a system where meals came regularly, where portions were often larger than what they had known, where meat and cigarettes appeared with a frequency that contradicted their expectations. The Wikipedia overview even notes prisoners' complaints about the inferiority of American white bread and coffee, complaints that, when read carefully, reveal something deeper. The prisoners were so accustomed to scarcity that they initially interpreted abundance as a trick. And even when they complained, they still recognized they were being treated better than elsewhere. A German woman captive, emerging from Europe's wreckage, the first bite of that bread could feel like stepping into a world where the normal laws of war had been suspended. White bread is not romantic. It is not a noble symbol. That is why it works. Because authoritarian states often survive on spectacle, parades, banners, salutes, slogans, performances, designed to make belief feel inevitable. White bread is the opposite of spectacle. It is quiet. It is ordinary. It arrives without drama. It tastes like normal life continuing. And normal life continuing under a democracy was an argument Nazi propaganda could not easily answer. The American camp system, as described in General Oss, often resembled military training sites more than medieval prisons. Prisoners were separated by rank. Officers had different conditions, work programs existed, and wages were paid in camp scrip. Libraries, camp newspapers, and entertainment were common. These features were not purely benevolent, they also served order and control, but they created a lived environment in which prisoners could observe the functioning of an organized society. Observation is what mattered, because the German women in this story did not need a lecture at first. They needed a crack in the wall. They needed a visible inconsistency in the narrative they had been given since childhood. That crack appeared in the simplest places: the way Americans treated time, the way they enforced procedure, the way guards behaved as employees of a system rather than as personal instruments of vengeance, and the way American women behaved. In the German worldview constructed by the Reich, women were constantly reminded that public life belonged to men. Even when women entered war support roles, they did so under a narrative that framed their labor as service to male combat, not as independent citizenship. But America, whatever its faults, had normalized women's movement into public work at a national scale during the war years. The WWII was one expression of that, and the existence of massive training centers demonstrates institutional commitment. So imagine a German woman captive, perhaps an auxiliary clerk or nurse, who has been marched through the last weeks of war and delivered into an American-controlled holding facility. She watches an American woman in uniform carrying a clipboard, issuing instructions, checking names. The American woman's authority is not theatrical. It is not shouted. It is procedural. It does not require violence to be felt, and that German captive realizes something unsettling. In this system, power does not always wear a man's face. This realization does not instantly produce admiration. It can produce resentment. It can produce disbelief. It can produce the strange, defensive impulse to interpret confidence as arrogance, but it plants the doubt. And once doubt exists, propaganda cannot fully restore innocence. In the broader German POW experience in America, one repeated theme is that many prisoners were surprised by the relative normality of their captivity and by the ability to interact, sometimes illicitly, with local civilians. The Wikipedia overview even notes that fraternization with American women could become a problem, indicating that contact did occur despite official restrictions. A separate example from Gettysburg area POW history shows how local women's presence near camps drew comment described explicitly as women loitering about the camp. Enough of an issue that officers monitored it, whether motivated by curiosity, attraction, or simple fascination with the enemy behind wire. The fact that women could drive to a camp, linger, and watch was itself a glimpse of civilian freedom in action. For German women captives, that civilian behavior could look like another form of unsettling liberty. Women acting without constant supervision, making choices that were not framed as shameful or dangerous. It is important here to keep the rhythm of history honest. Not all German prisoners were treated well at all times. There were incidents, tensions, and the psychological weight of captivity remained real. Nor was America free of injustice. Racial segregation, for example, shaped American military life in ways German captives sometimes noticed with confusion. But the narrative's core truth remains: the American system often revealed to German captives a society that could enforce order without demanding ideological worship. And that difference matters, because Nazism had made worship a condition of belonging. Even inside POW camps, Nazi ideology did not instantly disappear. Hardcore Nazis inside compounds intimidated other prisoners, held kangaroo courts, and committed violence. American authorities became concerned enough to pursue countermeasures, including separation of extremist prisoners and the development of re-education efforts. This is where the story turns from personal shock to institutional intent. By 1944, as documented in a HistoryNet account, Dorothy Thompson, an American journalist expelled from Nazi Germany in 1934, and Eleanor Roosevelt played roles in pushing the U.S. administration to address Nazi control within POW camps. Secretary of War Henry Stimson's directive framed the goal not as turning Germans into Americans, but as giving prisoners respect for the quality and potency of American institutions. The program was kept secret both for fear of German retaliation and because of Geneva Convention constraints. Reeducation took multiple forms: newspapers, books, films, classes. One prominent example was Der Ruf, a German-language newspaper produced by carefully screened anti-Nazi prisoners in a secret re-education context, distributed across camps. Accounts of Der Ruf note that ardent Nazis sometimes called it propaganda and even burned it, while other prisoners welcomed it and wrote letters praising it. But even here, the narrative should not overstate what paper could accomplish alone. Printed words can be rejected. Films can be dismissed. But lived experience is harder to refute. If the American woman behind the desk speaks with quiet authority, you cannot unsee it. If the American system delivers bread daily, you cannot easily declare it a lie. And bread again returns, because for German captives, the encounter with abundance was not merely comfort, it was ideological destabilization. The Reich's narrative had promised that democracies were decadent and therefore weak, but the ability to supply food, run camps, and sustain an economy while fighting a global war looked like strength, not weakness. In post-war Germany, the symbolic power of American provision continued. Army account preserves the memory of a German who, as a child, received school lunches and care-supported supplies after the war, describing a time of near starvation and recalling American soldiers giving candy, chocolate, and bubble gum treasures. This memory underscores how American abundance became associated with survival in a sense that Americans no longer saw Germans as enemies. That transition from enemy to human being was not automatic. It took time, policy, and political choice, but the sensory proof of abundance was one of the first bridges. For German women captives, the bridge had another plank: the behavior of American women. The title's key phrases, confidence and freedom. Those are not just feelings. They are social products. Confidence comes from what happens to you when you speak. If speaking leads to punishment, confidence becomes dangerous. If speaking leads to argument, disagreement, even discipline but not destruction, confidence becomes possible. Freedom comes from what happens to you when you move through the world. If movement requires permission at every step, freedom becomes a rumor. If movement is assumed unless prohibited, freedom becomes a habit. German women captives, raised inside a state where habits were engineered, encountered a society where certain habits emerged from a different foundation. They saw women participating in war work as a civic norm, not merely as a temporary emergency. They saw women in uniform and administration at scale, and they saw what that produced: a posture that looked like ownership. That posture did not require loud ideological speeches. It required only daily practice. In the American POW system, daily practice also appeared in the smallest bureaucratic details: camp labor forms, scrip, canteens, scheduled routines, and the insistence, at least early and mid-war, on Geneva Convention compliance. It was the unromantic machinery of an organized state, and for some German prisoners, the shock of that organized state became a kind of involuntary education, not about America's moral perfection, but about the practical potency of American institutions. That phrase, potency of American institutions, appears almost like a cold, bureaucratic objective in the re-education program's framing, but for a captive, it could be felt in the body, in full meals, in medical checks, in the fact that the camp did not dissolve into chaos. A German woman captive could hate America and still notice this. She could resent her defeat and still notice. She could fear the future and still notice. In this story, the transformation is not sentimental admiration. It is a forced confrontation with evidence. Evidence has a way of humiliating ideology, because ideology is often in agreement to ignore evidence. And then came the most brutal evidence of all: The exposure of Nazi crimes as Allied forces liberated concentration camps. Atrocity footage was shown to German POWs. Accounts describe shock, anger, disbelief, and in some cases symbolic reactions such as prisoners burning uniforms after compulsory viewing. For German women captives who had lived under censorship, rumor, and partial knowledge, such footage could feel like an earthquake beneath identity itself. If the Reich had lied about America, what else had it lied about? If the Reich had promised honor, what had it actually built? If the Reich had demanded sacrifice, what had it consumed? This is where the story's emotional weight deepens because it becomes about more than captivity. It becomes about the collapse of a worldview, and into that collapse, the recurring symbol returns again: white bread. In the aftermath of a dictatorship, people often remember the grand historical turning points: capitulation, occupation, trials, but people also remember what their hands touched. A slice of bread, soft and pale, placed on a tray, a smell of coffee in a mess hall. The fact that it arrived reliably, the fact that no one made them chant before receiving it. The fact that American women moved through the room as if they belonged there. This is not sentimental. It is documentary truth in sensory form. Small details can carry ideological impact when they embody a contradiction. In a system built on scarcity and control, abundance looks like sabotage. In a system built on enforced gender hierarchy, female confidence looks like rebellion. So German women captives were shaken because the American example undermined two pillars at once: the myth that democracy was weak, and the myth that women's freedom was disorder. They saw that a society could allow women to act with autonomy and still mobilize effectively. They saw that a society could refrain from theatrical cruelty and still win. They saw that a society could feed its captives and still command global power. In the end, the question that haunted them was not, why are Americans kind? Kindness can be dismissed as propaganda. The haunting question was deeper and more corrosive. If Americans are decadent, why do they have so much? If democracy is chaos, why does it function? If women's freedom is collapse, why do American women look so composed? If the Reich was destiny, why is destiny now behind wire, eating American bread? And there is one more element, quiet, almost invisible, that deepens the symbolism. In captivity and in occupied Germany, American abundance was not always delivered by soldiers alone. It was also delivered through institutions, care packages, organized relief, school lunch programs, systems that extended beyond the individual goodwill of a passing GI. That institutional character matters, because authoritarian regimes often build dependence on the leader, the party, the uniform. Democracies at their best build dependence on procedures that outlast individuals. So when a German child remembered lunchboxes being filled through care-related support, the memory was not only of taste, but of structure. A system that decided children should not starve. For German women captives, the American woman's confidence was part of that same structure. She was not confident because she was reckless. She was confident because she lived inside a system that did not require her to be small. And here is the paradox at the heart of this story. The Reich tried to build unity by forcing everyone into the same posture. America, for all its contradictions, produced unity through a different mechanism, allowing individuals to stand as themselves, then asking them to serve. That is why the American woman's confidence mattered so much. It was not merely personal style. It was the visible sign of citizenship. Citizenship is dangerous to totalitarianism because a citizen feels ownership of the state, a subject feels ownership by the state. German women captives watching American women move through military life with quiet authority could not easily return to the old belief that women must be owned to be safe. And that is the transformation this title gestures toward, not a sudden conversion, but a fracture in the old grammar of fear. Epilogue. Years later, the camps were dismantled or forgotten. Many Americans who lived near them barely remembered they existed, yet the records remain the scale of captivity. The adherence, however imperfect, to international standards, the re-education programs, the camp newspapers, the routine of organized life, behind wire. And across that record runs a quiet thread of human memory, the taste of survival, the posture of freedom, and the ordinary symbols that become extraordinary when they contradict a lie. White bread, not heroic, not sacred, simply plentiful. A slice that could be discarded in a country that had enough. While in Europe, people had learned to measure life in crumbs. And perhaps that is the final truth this experience reveals. Freedom is not only a slogan spoken into a microphone. Freedom is infrastructure. Freedom is predictability. Freedom is a system that can afford restraint. Freedom is a society that can allow women to stand upright without collapsing into panic. Freedom is the ability to feed even an enemy and still remain strong. When German women captives encountered American women's confidence and freedom, they were not merely seeing different personalities. They were seeing the visible surface of an entire political philosophy, one that did not demand worship to function, one that produced enough bread to make a lie taste hollow. And long after the war's thunder faded, long after uniforms were packed away and borders redrawn, that hollow taste remained like a question the old ideology could never answer.